It seems like overnight everybody picked up Razor's Cutlass and dropped their favorite medium weapon. Like, what happened? Well, nothing actually changed about the Cutlass. Now it's easier to view bleed damage on any weapon, so people got reminded. Let's dive right into this mechanic and check it out. But before we start, if you don't know what I'm talking about, check out my last video on the recent update. I got some fun videos on the way and keep an eye out for that. Trivia time. Imagine you're at the TheRealPunchee Deepwoken Zoo, which is real because I just made it, and something goes wrong. Monsters are loose, people are freaking out, it's crazy. You're not worried about taking damage because, of course, you have over 600 HP, but unfortunately, you are not invincible. You have a flaw that makes you afraid of blood, and you know, we don't want that. So, 3 monsters pull up, and which one's making me bleed? A lionfish, a thresher, or a squibbo? All of these guys are terrifying, but which one is the scariest? Be warned, because if you guess incorrectly, both you and the monster make a blood vow subscription to TheRealPunchee. Alright, believe it or not, the drowned god of evolution has granted threshers the ability to bleed on successful claw slashes. They have the tools to deal damage, but they don't have eyes to play Deepwoken with, so who's really winning? And on that topic, we'll be looking at the bleed mechanic, don't get it confused with the blood mechanic, and before anyone asks, that's blood loss and not bleed damage, so we're not going to be talking about that here. Bleed damage can be dealt a few different ways, but we'll start with the weapons. Bleed weapons function like normal, but on hit they deal basic damage and bleed damage. Bleed damage is 30% of your normal M1 damage, separated into 3 hits, which do 10% each. If you're confused, you can usually tell when bleed activates when bonus blood particles pop up, and you can even hear it against certain mobs. Putting the bleed effect into a category is difficult because it isn't quite a status that can be removed, and we cannot verify what type of damage it is. Some weapons do physical damage or elemental damage, while bleed is just a mystery. I couldn't find any armor with bleed resistance or any way to reduce its damage, so I think it scales off the weapon used and the weapon damage type. Speaking of which, some weapons have innate bleed and others perform a little bit differently. The recent Deepwoken UI changes have allowed us to see bleed damage on certain weapons. Right here I'm using a skull piercer which has innate bleed, which does 24.5% base damage, with the bleed damage being 7.3, which is 30% of 24.5. Commonly used bleed weapons are the Razor's Cutlass, Archon's War Spear, and the Crescent Cleaver, and maybe the skull piercer if you picked it up last Holotide. All of these weapons are innate bleed weapons that always end up doing 30% extra damage on an M1, and most of the time that is unpreventable damage. But regardless, I think that bleed weapons are very consistent with their damage because it will always bleed on every M1 except for a flourish. And even still, your crit attacks will hurt more, resulting in even more bleeding. There's also some weird stuff with other weapons that don't have innate bleed, like both the katana and shattered katana do not deal bleed damage on their M1s and lack innate bleed, but for some reason their crit attacks gain some bonus damage with a bleed effect. You can hear its activation on this golem. Well, if you don't have a bleed weapon, there are ways to deal bleed damage without having that. You cannot stack the effects of these talents with bleed weapons, but nevertheless they're solid picks. Talents like Speed Demon weaponize your momentum and deactivate once you hit an M1 and deal bleed damage. For builds with wind gems or obfuscation, this is a great way to deal bleed damage. Even certain weapons get talents based on bleed, just like spears. The talent Lancer's Impale rewards successful dodges with a bleeding attack, and remember, this is extra good on spear due to its multi-hit critical. However you deal bleed damage through a weapon or through a talent, this feature is much more apparent than people had thought. I recommend you guys check it out because it's really fun to create a bleed based build. Anyway, that's all from me, and comment down below if you'd attend the TheRealPunchee Deepwoken Zoo. As always, make sure to like and subscribe, and have a good one.